Hello, Literature Writing 338 students. Hi, welcome to the History of Western Children's Literature. Let me share my screen with you so you can check out my fancy PowerPoint. Children's literature. So dividing the world into like East and West is at best a superficial division and at worst a really fraught project based in colonialism and racism and xenophobia and stuff like that. But the term Western has traditionally represented the history and traditions of various countries, including the US and Australia and New Zealand, among others, that have been heavily influenced by European culture in the wake of colonialism, along with European countries themselves. So that tends to be what people refer to as the West, or what they call Western. And I use this term here, even though I don't think it's a perfect term, because I want to acknowledge the fact that the history of children's literature that I'm providing for you begins with this European inherited tradition, especially in the earlier parts of the class, rather than a broader global view. This is partially because of my training. I'm a medieval and Renaissance England specialist, so that's partially because that's my training, but also because we're focused on American children's literature. And I want you to understand that the historical factors like class, race, gender, etc., that have shaped the trajectory of children's literature in the US. And many of these are inherited from the European history and tradition that has shaped America. In the time before this class starts, the history before this class starts, and in the places that aren't what this class is covering, children's literature wasn't always a thing, right? Many cultures, in fact, most cultures in the history of the planet, didn't have a designated separate kind of literature that was just for children. Children listened to the same stories that adults listened to. They listened to all the stories together. This is true for most of the history of the world. It wasn't like, this is for adults to listen to, this is for children to listen to. Stories were just stories. In medieval Europe, once some different factors combined to allow for the development of grammar schools that were mostly for middle and upper class boys to attend, but with the development of grammar schools for children came the development of educational materials designed specifically for children, such as English horn books, and that's what you have a picture of right here, called horn books because they were made from the horn of various creatures. So you can see that they come about around the 15th century, like I said, soon after the development of widespread grammar schools, which before that were unusual. Mostly you were educated via tutor if you had the money to do so. So some of the first literature then designated for children in Europe was educational in nature. And you can kind of see there a little bit, it's got religious content, Our Father which art in heaven, the Lord's Prayer. It's got information about how to do your letters, etc., etc. So very educational, not necessarily in the vein of entertainment that we might think of now. And this idea that children's literature should teach children something has continued even today. So some of the earliest texts that we have that were part of this tradition of educational literature for children survive. One of these is the Orbis Pictus, which I'm showing you here, by John Comenius. That's the author.
On this page, you can see how he's combined images with words to explain how to pronounce the sounds of the letters.
John Comenius saw as the function or purpose of his book is to provide moral center for children, to help students learn what they needed to know to be adults. And these things are still, again, very much a part of children's literature in a lot of ways. In the 18th century, children's literature begins to shift a little bit more and become a lot more common. In particular, we shift away from just strictly educating and we shift towards the idea that the literature should interest children and excite them and maybe delight them a little bit. So John Newbery, who's often considered the father of children's literature, is one of the folks that we see develop a children's literature book that's more on the sense of trying to be fun and delightful while also teaching a lesson. That doesn't go away. So Little Pretty Pocketbook from 1744, the ball once struck off, away flies the boy to the next destined post and then home with joy. It rhymes. We're used to seeing that with children's literature. But then look, there's a moral. Thus Britons for lucre is money, fly over the main, across the sea, right? But with pleasure transported, return back again. Everyone flies over to America to make money, but they come back because, Britain's awesome. This is what Newbery said. One of the things that makes him the quote-unquote father of children's literature, at least in the Anglo-American tradition, is that he demonstrated that children's literature was a viable commercial enterprise, one of the first to demonstrate that children's were actually an audience. And this comes partially because of some changes in the economy due to things like the Industrial Revolution, where a middle class emerges in a way. Eventually, the idea that children were like unique creatures with their their own needs that are very different from adults begin to emerge. This is an idea that didn't necessarily have currency in medieval or Renaissance England or Europe, but eventually, after the influence of a number of philosophers from the 18th and early 19th century, who we'll talk about again in the next video when I talk more about the Golden Age, they impact the way that folks think about childhood. Especially popular in Romantic and Victorian England and in the late 19th century was the idea that children are romantic and innocent, right? That they're not young little adults who are just as evil or good as regular adults, but that they are innocent themselves, and that they need to be protected, right? So they start to become almost like a protected category. And this period of children's literature, which you can see is the late 19th and the early 20th century, is known as the Golden Age because it was a huge time period of production of literature for children, and in particular literature that didn't just entertain but also delighted children. And one of the ways it did that is by the inclusion of fantastical elements like magic and creatures that can speak, and things that we would call today speculative or imaginative. In other words, things that aren't supported by the science that we know about today. Okay. All right, so that's the Golden Age of children's literature, which we're going to be reading about and focusing on pretty much all this week. And finally, for today, children's literature as an established Western literary discipline develops in the 20th century. It develops really in the mid-20th century, around the same time that children's literature develops away from Golden Age literature into this new genre that's sometimes referred to as New Realism. So the first folks that were interested in children's literature were women who were teaching children's literature. And then eventually academics became interested in it through three different areas, through education, through childhood development and psychology, and in literary studies. And we all have our own approach towards children's literature. So in the middle of the 20th century, in addition to the discipline sort of arising, we see a shift in the content of the literature. And one of the main things that happens is we see that the idea that children have to be protected and are innocent starts to loosen up, and the idea from developmental psychology that children can deal with things a little bit at a time over the course of their lives, and we do need to introduce things that maybe previously you wanted to hide from them in a safe way. That idea starts to permeate literature and literary representations. So you see things that you wouldn't maybe have seen before, like divorce or domestic violence, or, I remember Judy Blume has the whole thing where her dad's trying to was it Beverly Cleary? Oh, I forget. Ramona's dad's trying to quit smoking, and so things like that. The other thing that happens is that in the Golden Age, children's literature was really dominated by white, middle-class, or aristocratic male writers. Some female writers, but largely male. So in the mid-century, we do start to see a little bit more diversity, although that's still an issue with children's literature. It's still very much dominated by white authors, white characters, white children. That's still very much a statistical reality in children's literature. Examining the history of children's literature can help us understand both how we look at children in our culture and how we look at literature. Like, what's the point of stories we tell? What's the point of stories we tell to children in particular? Why do we tell them? What role do they play in helping us to figure out who we are, and in helping our children to figure out who they are? These are some of the questions that we're going to continue to explore as we go throughout the course. Thanks. I'm going to stop the share and stop the video. I will see you in the next one.